Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. My name is Alex Rice. I am a professor in the math department here at Millsaps. And as of just this past fall, I'm also the director of the honors program at the college. And of all the things we do at Millsaps, this is one of the most rewarding and most important programs. The students that are presenting today started this process by attending a little orientation meeting about this program, and that took place in September of 2020. So that is 17 months ago. Okay, so that's how long, they had to identify a faculty mentor, they had to identify a topic, they had to do their research, collect their data, or whatever creative or research project that they're doing. They had to draft an extensive thesis, and during that entire process, they had to decide, they had to be self-starting in that endeavor. They had to decide when to put in the time and effort to do that in the midst of their full class loads. And in that sense, I would say by far this program is the experience we offer at Millsaps that most closely approximates what people do in graduate work and also in advanced disciplinary research. So of all the things we do at Millsaps, this is probably the most mature academic experience that we offer. So the students today are going to do their very best to distill that 17-month process into about 15 minutes for you. And that can be difficult, but these are some of our best and brightest students, and we're so glad that you're here to support them and these projects. Like I said, each presentation will be roughly 15 minutes. We'll have time for questions after each presentation. The presentations are blocked into sessions. There are 2 sessions today, each with 4 talks, and in between there will be a 20-minute break, during which I encourage you to continue to help yourself to all the coffee and cookies and drinks out there, and then we'll do another 4 talks after the break. I think I've basically said what I want to say. We will have time. This is also being live streamed on YouTube for people who can't make it. Also, the college's chapter of Phi Beta Kappa will be evaluating the presentations and the theses on which those presentations are based, and they'll be recognizing some students with awards after the last session ends tomorrow. That's not, that's sort of a side dish of this event. It's certainly not a competition. It really is a culmination and a celebration for all of these students. We have 17 this year, which, I just took over this program, directing this program, but I can look back at past years. It's one of the biggest groups that we've had. So I think what I want to do now is, you'll note in your programs, and if you don't have a program, there's a stack of them right there if you want one. I'm talking to you now. I wanted to say hello and introduce myself, but my goal is for you to see very little of me for the rest of the time. Each of the sessions is going to be moderated by one of our honors students. And so the first session is going to be moderated by a student who will be speaking later today doing honors in geoscience, but for now she'll be moderating, and that is Lindsey Howard. Come on up.
Hey, I'm Lindsey. So I'll be doing the first session for Mayor Francis, Hannah, KATELYN, and Riley. Hannah asked me to do a 5-minute check for each person. So I was going to raise, for her, I'm going to raise my hand at the end of 15 minutes just to make sure nobody goes over time. I'm gonna be sitting right there. If not, I might kind of whisper at you or something, but I don't see that being a problem, just so that everybody knows. And if y'all have any questions or anything, just let me know, and I'll just introduce each person, then ask the audience if there's any questions at the end, and then proceed with the next speaker. So first off, Mary Frances Dickey with an honors in English. Her research project is A Torrent of Light, Promethean Ambition, and Narrative Intertextuality. So if everybody will welcome Mary Frances.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's really just an honor to be kicking off this year's honors conference. I'm trying to find, there it is, up top. All righty. Let's full screen this bad boy. I'm sorry, I'm a Mac kid. I am not the best at PCs, but we're gonna do our best. There we go. Don't do that. Gosh. Okay, we're gonna go with this for now. So I want to start this presentation off with a sort of clarification of what this thesis is. Overall, it is a study of a particular archetypal narrative, the narrative of Promethean ambition, and how consecutive works of literature interpret and reinterpret it, hence the intertextuality in the title. Now, I know that is kind of a mouthful, but don't worry, we're going to unpack it as I go along. I started the thesis off with some literary criticism, focusing mainly on Paradise Lost by John Milton and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. The critical piece concludes on sort of the synthesis of my findings that Mary Shelley, in writing Frankenstein, correlates Miltonic and romantic conceptions of ambition to point out the really quite devastating effects of her romantic peers' ideology in her experience and in those of their loved ones. The creative piece that follows, after assessing Milton's and Shelley's interpretations of Promethean ambition, I wanted to write a short fiction of my own, working with similar themes, sort of putting the narrative pattern that I observed into practice, and we're gonna get to that. But in following sort of the trajectory of the thesis, I'm going to get started with my literary criticism. Now, in analyzing the narrative of Promethean ambition in both Paradise Lost and Frankenstein, when you do literary criticism, one generally starts off with a literary theory, and my theory of choice was archetypal criticism. And we get that from, in part, Northrop Frye, who writes in The Archetypes of Literature that all archetypes, whether they be character-based or narrative-based or something of that sort, can all be traced back to classical mythology. Now, looking at Paradise Lost and Frankenstein, I sort of trace them back to the narrative of Prometheus. We all know him, we all love him, the gods don't. But I turned to Aeschylus's tragedy, Prometheus Bound. Now, this is not the first historical record of Prometheus in writing, but it is the first tragic retelling of his story. Aeschylus's Prometheus is, I would say, the basis for the Miltonic Satan and some heroes of romantic literature. But first, I'd like to lay out the characteristics of the Promethean ambition narrative. I boiled them down, excuse me, to two sort of basic steps. The first discusses a character's desire to educate and assist another party despite adversity or disapproval from another party. In Prometheus' case, it's the gods. That sort of ambition is followed by a fall or a punishment, which then strengthens the character's resolution rather than trotting them down into the dirt, and strengthens their belief in their actions as well as their willingness to defy the opposing power. Now, with that narrative in mind, we look to Milton and Shelley's representations of Promethean ambition in their work. So, in terms of Paradise Lost, Satan is Milton's most traditionally Promethean character, but Milton reverses the narrative of Promethean ambition that I've just laid out for y'all. Satan, rather than starting with a desire to educate, rebels first and falls into hell. And then he seeks revenge on the Father in heaven by educating mankind. He is consumed by his own ambition. He is intimately aware of the pain that it causes him and his peers in hell. I believe in book 4 it is, I quote, there is a line where he finishes off one of his monologues by saying, "Such joy ambition finds," which I think is really telling for Satan's character. Milton characterizes his ambition, therefore, as pretty much wholly destructive. Then we have Eve, who I would argue is also one of Milton's Promethean characters. Like Prometheus, she seeks equality through knowledge, but not equality for another party, equality for herself. She exists in a hierarchy in Eden, that of, God the Father, angels, Adam, and then Eve. She's at the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak. And so she wants equality for herself, and when she realizes she's not going to get it from the angels or from Adam, she seeks it out on her own. She is autonomous, and Milton depicts her ambition as constructive. Now, she does brush with the destructive when she is deceived by Satan. She considers, not imparting the knowledge that she receives with Adam, and maintaining sort of an authority over him as he has had over her. But eventually, she and Adam, after falling together, experiencing a deep depression, when they are expelled from Eden, they persist together. They quite literally join hands and venture into the rest of the world, regardless of what lies in front of them. Milton has them sally forth together, if you will, and continuing in their ambition to survive collectively. By so doing, he suggests that Promethean ambition can be constructive, that willingness to persist despite a fall can be constructive when done collectively with one's peers, when it's not an entirely selfish motivation. Now, with that in mind, we look to Frankenstein, and we wonder, how does she interpret Aeschylus's Prometheus and Milton's Prometheus? Now, I bring up Milton at the start of my discussion of Shelley because we really do have to address her attention to Paradise Lost in writing Frankenstein. I've read her journals, I've read her letters, and she was reading it with her husband Percy Shelley while she wrote Frankenstein. But this correlation goes beyond coincidence, a mere passing of Milton's language into her work. Her interpretation of the archetypes and Milton's characters through her writing in Frankenstein is deliberate. We can see that in her characters, all three narrators of Frankenstein. We have Walton, the ship's captain, we have Victor, Frankenstein, and we have the creature, Victor's creation. Walton and the creature both seek equality through knowledge, like Milton's Eve, and Victor, like Satan, acts selfishly and languishes in the consequences of his actions. However, crucially, unlike any of Milton's characters, no one benefits. There is no collective movement forward. Each narrator, be it Walton, Victor, or the creature, is consumed by his own ambition, whether that's to discover or to create and then uncreate, or to become equal with humanity and then, seek revenge for the rejection. No one benefits. Everyone just has a bad time. And everybody fails in their ambition, so to speak. So Shelley's Promethean allusions in Frankenstein are many. I mean, it's right there in the title. The full title of Frankenstein is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. So we see all these allusions to Aeschylus and to Milton, and we wonder, what is her purpose in combining these Aeschylean and Miltonic allusions in her characters? So here is where I looked, pardon me, to her biographical and historical context and her relationships to her contemporaries. She's a young author in the late Romantic era, and she's in close quarters with Lord Byron and Percy Shelley. She actually eloped with Percy when she was 16 and traveled frequently with him and lived in Geneva with Percy and her stepsister Claire. Both Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, who are sort of the big names that she was with frequently, wrote pieces regarding the Aeschylean Prometheus. You have Byron's poem entitled Prometheus, and Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, which is a direct retelling of the Aeschylus tragedy. But furthermore, the Romantics in their writing revere preceding monumental authors, and they wish to emulate them in their quest for poetic genius, predecessors like Milton. Shelley saw the results of this drive for greatness firsthand. By the time she wrote Frankenstein, she was 18. She had lost her first child. It had died shortly after it was born. Her half-sister, as well as Percy's estranged wife, Harriet, had both killed themselves. And her stepsister, Claire, had carried on an affair with Percy and was now pregnant by Lord Byron. In eloping with Percy, Mary shared an ideal with him to, shirk societal norms and to live in freedom with like-minded peers. But she suffers the reality of their elopement and the consequences of their sort of loftier ideals, whereas Percy is not necessarily deterred. Now, I am not the first to draw this conclusion, but I point specifically to the creature's development as an example of Mary's criticisms of romantic ideals. Most critics will point to Victor or even to Walton, but none that I could see really dove into the creature's development in relation to the Romantics. Now, one of the most crucial parts in the creature's narrative, I would argue, is when he reads Paradise Lost while he is in hiding. He reads it, and I quote, as a true history. And his actions throughout the novel seek to emulate Milton's characters. He compares himself to Adam. He compares himself to Satan. He finds no identity within them. As I stated before, he is probably most similar to Eve, but he doesn't realize this, and he does not, he's unable to sally forth with Victor or with humanity. They won't let him, they reject him. He cannot move forward collectively with the environment in which he is placed. It rejects him, and these failed comparisons kind of correlate him with the Romantics in their attempts to, emulate the writers who have come before them. Now, they were more or less successful posthumously, but in their lives, they left sort of a line of ruined lives in their wake. And so Mary Shelley is using the creature to point to how aspiring to be this sort of greater being, to emulate these greater writers who have come before you, you may succeed in the future, but in reality, in the present, there are very, very real consequences. Now, some critics that I read would find Shelley's criticisms conservative or even unintentional, but I would argue that they are deliberate and perhaps more radical than that of her peers in her advocacy for empathy and, to put it bluntly, common sense. Ultimately, I would argue that Shelley correlates these Miltonic and Romantic interpretations of Promethean ambition and criticizes, through Milton's really hallowed narrative of Paradise Lost, and characters, her peers' idolization of Promethean ambition and its relation to authorship. And so that is sort of the conclusion of my critical piece. Following the critical piece, as I stated, I wrote a short fiction of my own, and I am in no way claiming to be as profound a writer as Milton or Shelley, but part of my study was to put the pattern that I saw into practice. So a brief summary of the creative piece, I'm going to read an excerpt in a second, but it concerns a character named Oliver. He was cursed to invisibility as a young boy and is looking to do the results of that sort of Promethean act and mend his relationship in the process with his cousin. But his ambition to undo what has been done to him prevents both of them from fully healing from the traumas of their past. And the excerpt that I am going to read is from the conclusion, in which Oliver paints his face with circus makeup to see if that works. He's at his wit's end, and he's willing to really try anything. As he worked, Oliver felt that curious anticipation he knew from approaching his mirror sidelong, yet he couldn't quite feel as uncertain about it as his face took form under his fingers. He saw the sweep of his cheekbone cast a shadow over his jaw and felt his heart leap. He traced his eyebrows with his finger and followed it with a dark paint on a delicate brush. doing his best to mimic the fine hair that he felt. Pieced together like patterned sections or a delicate instrument, his face came into view. His heart pounded as he sat back, searching for what he had become. He could almost have accepted it, if not for the empty, almond-shaped spaces where his eyes might have been. He saw the back of his apartment through them in the mirror, and much of the same when he opened his mouth. When he turned his head, the makeup looked thin, a film coating the external contours of his face. He saw the curve of his profile and nothing behind it, just the upholstery of his chair where his skull stayed invisible. A flesh-toned mask hung above his collar. Only the scabs on Oliver's knuckles showed against it when he reached, numb, to touch. Now, in conclusion, we can observe, I'm sure you can tell, I worked on this for about 17 months. It's quite an important piece to me. But why in general might we find this study important? Well, I would argue that, we write in part based on that which precedes us. I'm sure I'm not remiss in saying that we've all read at least one book or two in our lifetime. But we see that synthesis and that intertextuality in practice in the development of the Promethean ambition narrative. You see it in Aeschylus, you see the tragic Prometheus there, you see it interpreted by Milton and then reinterpreted by Shelley. In order to write, I would argue, we have to understand in part how these narratives are developed before us. And that's in part, I would argue, why we study literature, to observe that chain of thought and perhaps add another link and understand specifically what compels authors of entirely different generations to keep that chain going. Thank you all so much for being here today. I really quite appreciate it.
Alrighty, we have a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have one for Mary Frances? Yes.
Was there a moment where, in your reading or two, that you could describe where your sort of your moment of invention when you realized this was the thing that you were going to write about, and something that really gave you that kind of flash of insight?
Frankenstein is one of those novels that just sort of repeatedly comes back to me. There are a few pieces of literature that are like that, but Frankenstein is one of them. I was taking a class in the first semester of my junior year. It was Dr. McMaster's Milton class, and I remember reading Milton's poetry over and over again and looking back to Frankenstein and realizing, oh my gosh, there's sort of a back and forth going on here. Of course, Milton comes before Shelley. He's not necessarily interacting with her. But after reading Paradise Lost and after reading Frankenstein again, I couldn't read either work without thinking of the other. And and then in a literary theory class, done by you, we read a bit of Northrop Frye, and the concept of archetypal criticism just really clicked with me. And I realized, yeah, this is the sort of theory I'm going to apply to it, and how I'm going to go with it. Of course, I'd been working on it for some time by that point, but yeah, that's about the size of it.
Anybody else?
The creative piece that you wrote, is it a novella? Is it a novel? Like, are you planning on doing something with it?
It's a short fiction, but it concerns characters who I've been working on for, gosh, quite some time now. I think about 8 or 9 years. So they are up there, and I have been working on them for a while. I'd like to turn them into something someday, but for the purposes of this thesis, it was a short fiction.
Anybody else? Yes.
You talk a little bit about Mary Shelley's biography as influencing her interpretation of the Promethean myth, but you don't talk about her gender. Is that something that you thought about or considered in your research? Where did you come down on that?
Certainly, yes. In fact, in talking about Mary's intentionality as an author, a lot of the critics who I read, Harold Bloom or Paul Cantor, often referred to Shelley, first of all, as Miss Shelley or Mrs. Shelley, and seemed to downplay her intentionality as an author in a way that they wouldn't with Percy Shelley or Lord Byron. Harold Bloom specifically suggested that Mary's counterpoint, as he put it, to Promethean ambition, as symbolized by the Romantics, was almost, he suggested it was unintentional. And I was quite amazed by that, really. It seems that as a female author, Mary Shelley was sort of overlooked in her time and overlooked by critics that followed. Now, we are in the 21st century, and there has been a multitude of criticism that does acknowledge her as a female author and really put to use, or really sort of explain her voice as a female author in relation to, the male romantics whose, actions she's criticizing. So yes, that was a part of the thesis where I talked about her intentionality as an author and how, even as an 18-year-old, she had very much a mind of her own and very much like if you read her journal, she has a very keen eye for what is going on around her, which gets overlooked quite a bit.
Alrighty, I think that's all the questions we have, but Mary Frances will be around if y'all have any more questions y'all want to ask, but that was about our time limit for that, so let's give her another round of applause for that amazing presentation. Oh, this is so fun. We've got all the prep people. So next we have Hannah O'Brien with her honors in biology, and her research is on exploring species-level diversity of the Vaejovis scorpions in the Pinaleño Mountains in Arizona. So let's give it a hand for Hannah.
Thank you, everyone, again for being here. We're going to kind of shift gears a little bit into biology. So let me find my PowerPoint here really quickly, and then we'll get started. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so like Lindsey said, my honors thesis has been on studying the biodiversity of scorpions in Arizona. So before we kind of jump into that specifically, we should talk a little bit about what biodiversity in general is. So biodiversity, also known as biological diversity, is the idea of living variation from genes and traits to species and to ecosystems. So on the broadest level, biodiversity is what makes the Amazon different from the desert or Mississippi different from Alaska. On a smaller scale, biodiversity is what makes dogs different from horses or makes strawberries different from wheat. And then on the smallest level, biodiversity is what makes you and I different from one another and what makes different species of scorpions or spiders different from one another. So there's a lot of different levels of biodiversity. But why do we care about biodiversity? And it turns out there are a lot of different reasons why biodiversity is crucial to understand. And one of them is food. All animals require different nutrients, different types of nutrients. We have, of course, carnivores, omnivores, all those different things. And having different sources for nutrients is really important for health. And another aspect of that is for medicine. A lot of the traditional medicines and the modern medicines that we have as well have only been able to be discovered and created because we have studied other animals and plants and how they have adapted to defend themselves against different health threats. So that's a really important contribution to why we should understand biodiversity. Another aspect of that is cultural and economic value. A lot of different plants and animals, foods and things are very important to different cultures. And a lot of our identity is defined by by different things. And that makes us different from one another because we value those different things. And then the final kind of piece of this puzzle is being able to adapt to future climate change, to potential harm to groups. If we're all the same, then a drought comes in or we have some kind of parasite or something like that, then most likely that entire population could be wiped out. But if you have a diverse population, there's a potential for some of those organisms to be able to continue to adapt to that environment and to have a further adaptation and be able to survive. And one of the biggest things that you may know about biodiversity is the Save the Bees movement. A lot of us may have heard of this in passing, but the reason this is important is because pollinators are crucial to our plants and to our economy, and there are an estimated 4,000 known bee species, but these pollinator numbers are dropping. So this is important for us to know about their biodiversity, what makes each of these species different from one another, so that we can prevent them from going extinct. And so we could study biodiversity in bees, of course, and some people are doing that. But my project is focused on the biodiversity of arachnids in the Southwest, because my advisor, Dr. Hendrickson, has been doing a larger project on this to just kind of understand scorpions, tarantulas, all these different animals in the Southwest and what makes up their biodiversity. So my project is a smaller subset of his overall study and looking at a specific species in Arizona. So why do we care about scorpions? Well, one reason is because they're really cool, and why would we not want to know about scorpions? But some more specific reasons is because of their antiquity. This is a picture of a fossil that was found recently in the Rocky Mountains that dates back to about 500 million years ago. That's a really long time, and this is kind of an artistic depiction of what we expect that to look like. And you can see a lot of similarities in this to the scorpions that we have today. The segmented body structure, things of that nature that are very similar to the scorpions we have today. And so something that has been able to survive for this long, has been able to be a predator and successful for so long, it's important for us to understand those things, and understand what has made them successful. Another aspect is, of course, are they dangerous to us? They do have pinchers, they have tails, they're venomous, so it's important to understand, are they dangerous? Can we utilize those things to create medications and that sort of thing? And so that's kind of the final piece of this. What I was touched on with medicine earlier is scorpions can be used to produce new medications and new treatments, and this is an excerpt from some scientists who are currently targeting brain cancer using scorpion venom. So there are a lot of applications for this and a lot of reasons why it's important to be studied. But how do we study biodiversity? We know what it is, we know it's important, but how do we go about doing that? And there are a lot of different steps that you can take, a lot of different things you can look at to better understand biodiversity. And one of them is the morphological factors. So how big is the scorpion? How long is its tail? Those sorts of things, the basic physical attributes. What makes each of those different? Another aspect of that is on the genetic level, what makes these scorpions different from one another on the DNA level. And then finally is the geographic biodiversity. Are there rivers or caverns or something that are separating these different specimens or species from one another, or preventing them from commingling? And so those are three really important factors that all have to be taken into account when determining biodiversity of a group or determining if there are different species present. So where should we study biodiversity? We could do it here in the bowl, you could do it in your backyard, and I'm sure you would find some type of biodiversity, but there are actually 36 biodiversity hotspots around the globe, and you can see a map here of where those are. And these hotspots have at least 1,500 species that are endemic to that area, which means they can only be found in that area and nowhere else in the world. But they have also lost 70% of their primary native vegetation in recent years. So that means that we're losing species for whatever reason that we'll never be able to recover again. And so that's why they are hotspots and points of study. And you can see that there is one of these hotspots in North America, which is where we've been doing our research. And this is a bigger picture of that. You can see it's called the Madrean Pine Oak Woodlands hotspot. Most of it is found in Mexico, but it also stretches into the southeastern corner of Arizona, where my species is found. And then in this, we wonder, why is it a hotspot? And there are actually a lot of different reasons for why this has become a hotspot. There are 4 different ecoregions that are converging here, 3 major climate regions, as well as deserts, mountain ranges, all sorts of things converging in this one area. And each of those regions bring together their own specific species, their own groups of plants and animals, and they converge in this one spot, which creates a really unique location for a convergence of species. So it's actually a really cool place to do studies. And there's a specific region called the Madrean Sky Islands, which is where we've been doing research. So the Madrean Sky Islands are unfortunately not masses of land floating in the clouds. That'd be really cool, but that's not what it is. They're actually mountains in desert seas. So they're these mountains that have coniferous forests standing high above the sandy deserts, and animals with limited dispersal mechanisms like scorpions and snails are trapped on these island mountains. So they aren't able to travel to other mountain ranges in the area or cross the desert. And you can see a depiction here of how there's a stark difference. You can drive 30 minutes and you move from an area where there's tumbleweeds and cacti, and 30 minutes later you're in the middle of a conifer forest. And so you can see how there would be a huge change in animals and plants in those different locations. And then this is a map of that region where you can see that there are a lot of different mountain ranges that you can look at. And each of these mountain ranges has endemic species. And there's a specific group of scorpions called the Varese scorpions. And each mountain range has their own unique Varese scorpion. And there are 2 different mountain ranges that have been studied a little bit more than others. And those are the Santa Catalina Mountains and the Pinaleño Mountains. So in Arizona, there's been a previous study that found scorpions in the Santa Catalinas are diverging genetically. So there are 2 different groups that were once one group. And so that means that they are changing, their biodiversity is evolving. And so that's really interesting, but they're not changing morphologically. So you can see these little dots, they're overlapping a lot, so their physical structures are basically the same, they're the same size, that sort of thing. And there are also no geographic barriers that are found that would separate these 2 groups from one another. So the question is, why are they diverging? And there's poor sampling in other mountain ranges, but there is the Vaejovis electrum species that has been found in the Pinaleño Mountains, which is specifically what I was studying. And then just like scorpions, snails have limited dispersal capabilities, and multiple snails have been shown to diverge in the Pinaleños. So that made us question, could snails be diverging in the Pinaleños, scorpions be diverging in the Pinaleño Mountains as well? And if so, how does that contribute to the overall biodiversity of the Madrean Sky Islands? So the first thing we had to do to study this was, of course, to go into the field. And you can see this is the Pinaleño Mountains. And I collected specimens from these 4 different locations, which have varying vegetation, elevation levels. And there's a picture of my tent. I was actually able to go to Arizona and collect these specimens, which is really fun. You can collect them during the day. And this is a picture. I don't know if anyone can see a scorpion in this picture. It's right there. But they're really hard to find during the day because obviously they are the same color as the dirt. So another way you can find them is at night, and they fluoresce under ultraviolet light. So that's how a lot of them can be found. So once I collected specimens, around 50, we brought them back to the lab, extracted DNA, and these are some pictures of myself in the lab. And then after that, we conducted PCR and Sanger sequencing to amplify the DNA. So basically, PCR just takes one template of the DNA, amplifies it a bunch of times so that you have about 1 trillion copies of that DNA, because it's a lot easier to study something whenever you have a lot of them than if you just have one. And it gives us this chromatograph here that shows us on what the building blocks of their DNA is, and then we can use that to compare them to one another and see if there may be any differences. And then we took morphological measurements. You can see here, looking under a microscope at these, and there's also a picture of a baby scorpion, which I thought y'all might like to see. It's really cute. And then after we took those, I analyzed those genetic and morphological results to see what trends may be occurring in the populations. So the results were that there were no genetically different groups, and there's reference again for the locations. You can see that there are two potential lineages, two potential groups here, but they were not significantly different from one another, and so there may potentially be some divergence occurring, but nothing significant or as much as in the Santa Catalinas. And then additionally, there was no differences morphologically, so you can see there's a lot of overlap in body size here. Carapace is a proxy for body length. So the results were that there's no significant differences within groups. So this brings us to questions of why the Pinaleño scorpions are not diverging while the Santa Catalina scorpions are. And that is a further question that should be studied more. Additionally, why are the Pinaleño scorpions not diverging while the snails are? And part of that is due to the locations. They were, collected in different locations, so it's possible that if the scorpions were collected from those same locations, that there could be a different trend. Although I would suspect that it's most likely because of the habitat specificity. Talus snails have very specific habitats that they have to live in and are restricted to those, whereas scorpions are able to live in more diverse habitats, and so they may not need to diverge genetically to adapt to those different environments as much as the snails. So future recommendations for studies would be to look at other mountain ranges in this area to see if what the biodiversity looks like in those mountain ranges, if they are diverging like in the Santa Catalinas, or if they look more like the Pinaleños, and just kind of see what the overall Madrean Sky Islands look like, since currently there's only been significant studies in 2 of those mountain ranges. And there's currently, actually in the lab, I've been this semester working on scorpions from the Chiricahua Mountains, which are also in the Madrean Sky Islands. So that is something that work is already being done on, and then future students will hopefully be looking at the Huachuca Mountains as well to create a larger project to look at 4 to 5 different mountain ranges and get a better understanding of these scorpions as a entire population. So I would like to thank Dr. Hendrickson from the biology department for being my advisor during this project and allowing me to go to the field with him, and then also thank Dr. Rice, Dr. Toyota, the previous head of the Honors College, as well as Dr. Anglin and Dr. Prinshaw, who were on my reading committee, and the Millsaps College Honors Program, of course, for allowing me to go into the field and providing the monetary resources necessary for that. And of course, thank you all for being here and supporting this program. So if anyone has any questions. Yes, so that's a really good question. I think part of it is important to know that these locations were very accessible. They were along the same Arizona highway. So it is possible that if you go further into the mountains or explore these other locations, that there could be more biodiversity. But most likely, if there was a trend occurring in these mountain ranges, we would have seen it in those locations. So I think the best thing to do moving forward is to look at other mountain ranges. It is possible that there could be more trends if you look at other locations, but I think it's most likely that there are not the strong trends that we're seeing in the Santa Catalinas.
I was wondering when 2 groups are considered as being genetically
Yes, so there's a lot of different opinions about species, how you define a new species. Genetically, there are certain, I can't remember the numbers at the moment, I apologize, but there are specific expectations for how diverse a group would be, and there are statistical analyses that you can do to determine that. And then as a species as a whole, you take into account more than just the genetic diversity. You take into account, like I said, morphological and genetic variations as well. So there's a lot of it that goes into it, but there are kind of agreed upon numbers that are expected.
Anyone else? We have time for one more? Yes, again.
I was not. Dr. Hendrickson was great at teaching the correct way to pick them up so that you do not get stung, and I did not hold one necessarily in my hand. I always had them in the tweezers, so I did not want to get stung. I was a little cautious in that area.
I think it was a smart choice.
Thank you.
Great that Dr. Hendrickson over here is willingly
Right.
taking for this
All right, we all give Hannah a hand. Thank her one more time. Again, if y'all have any questions, we're all going to be around, so feel free to ask her any more. Alrighty, so next we have KATELYN NORSE with her honors in neuroscience, and her research was on uncovering the neural correlates of mid-level vision. So give it a hand for KATELYN. Let's see.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all again for coming. So like Lindsey said, my name's KATELYN, and today I will be presenting my honors thesis titled A Face or Not a Face, Uncovering the Neural Correlates of Mid-Level Vision. My thesis was done under the Department of Neuroscience and Psychology, with Dr. Nicholas Brunet being my primary reader. Okay, so to start off with, faces are some of the most informative stimuli that we will ever see in our lifetime. Within the first 150 milliseconds of seeing a face, we are able to tell a person's identity, mood, and age, along with other physical characteristics. This then leads us to the question of how exactly does the brain distinguish and identify faces from other objects? So there is a specific area in the brain termed the face fusiform area, and this is thought to be a specialized area in the brain that responds to stimuli of faces. As seen in the rotating image there, the face fusiform area is located on the bottom surface of the temporal lobe. Past research has shown that neurons in this area of the brain tend to be more active when looking at faces, but not as active when looking at objects or other body parts. Although the FFA is a primary area that's associated with faces, there are also two other areas, which is termed the occipital face area, or OFA, as well as the posterior superior temporal sulcus, or PSTS. And both of these areas have also been shown to play a role in the processing of faces. Specifically, the interaction between the OFA and FFA is thought to play a role in processing the identity of a face, while as the interaction between the OFA and PSTS is thought to play a role in processing the expressions of a face. But all of these areas together fully enable a complete processing of facial information along with smaller other minor areas. So in order to measure the neural response to faces, electroencephalography, better named EEG, is used. This method basically measures electrical brain activity that is elicited by the output of many neurons. So electrodes are attached to the scalp to record electrical charges from the activity of neurons in the brain. As seen in the right image there are many trials taken to produce one average of all the trials. So for example, this takes into account any discrepancies in the data. So for example, if a fly is in the room or you see something out of the corner of your eye, the same common information in each trial produces this average, leaving out these discrepancies. So we can measure how the brain responds to certain stimuli, such as an image. This is called an event-related potential, or ERP, which is a voltage generated in response to visual stimuli. The two main ERPs that were of concern to our study were the P100 and the N170. The P100 is basically a positive ERP component that peaks around 100 milliseconds, whereas the N170 is a negative ERP component that peaks around 170 milliseconds. And the N170 was the main focus of this study, as this ERP is generated by the face fusiform area and is also the typical component elicited when one sees faces. It is also generally more negative in response to faces than other visual stimuli such as objects and non-face stimuli. Both of these ERP components are important in almost all EEG studies, as the P100 and N170 even differ between healthy people and those with mental illness. So for example, those with schizophrenia tend to have a decrease in amplitude of their N170. So in order to investigate what factors determine the amplitude of the N170, we used EEG to study how the neuronal signal is rerouted between different specialized brain areas that respond to different classes of stimuli. We specifically studied ERP signals in response to pareidolia images. If you don't know what pareidolia is, it is basically the tendency to perceive faces, animals, and objects, and unrelated objects or patterns. It's more specifically described as the interpretation of any unrelated object seen for the first time as a face. So the fusiform face area is activated in the same way when seeing images of pareidolia compared to images of real faces, therefore eliciting a similar N170 ERP component. So in order to investigate this interpretation of pareidolia stimuli, 19 participants were shown the same 80 images of pareidolia in two different blocks. In the first block, we asked participants to click a corresponding button based on whether the preceding image appeared to be old or young. In block 2 of the experiment, they were shown the same 80 images again, but were then asked to click a corresponding button based on whether the preceding image appeared to be happy or sad. By priming participants, we hoped that exposure to the first pareidolia stimuli would influence how they would respond to the same pareidolia stimuli in a different context. So we were basically interested in finding out whether the same ambiguous photo perceived as an object in block 1 would yield a different ERP signal than when perceived as a face in block 2. So we basically hypothesized that the brain would elicit a larger P100 as well as a larger N170 in response to the images seen during block 2 than in block 1. We expected that perceiving the photos as faces would yield a signal that would be more similar to that elicited in response to actual faces. So while participants were performing each experiment, the EEG signals were recorded. So as you can see in that far left image, the EEG consisted of 32 electrodes, which were attached to a specific cap fit for the participant, as seen in the images. Each area in green in that left image corresponds to a sensor on a scalp that measures the signal. So although you can't really see it that clear, there's like a temporal area, a frontal area, parietal area, as well as an occipital area of the brain. There is also a ground electrode shown in black on that image, as well as a reference electrode shown in blue. So before recording could begin, each electrode signal had to be picked up by the EEG system, and this is better known as an impedance check. This was done by adding conductive gel to the space between the electrode and the participant's scalp, as seen in that far right image, until a signal was received. For each of the sensors, this conducting gel was applied until a high-quality signal was picked up. And once each sensor picked up a signal, recording was able to begin. The EEG data was then analyzed, and as stated earlier, we averaged the ERPs across clusters of electrodes to produce a more concise result. Specifically, the P100 and N70 were closely investigated, as these are the evoked potentials elicited when one sees faces. So now onto the results. As seen in the above graph, the old versus young condition, which was block 1, was recorded in light blue. And the happy versus sad condition, which was block 2, was recorded in pink. The dotted line corresponds to the response to normal faces. So as we can see, there isn't really any significant differences between the N170 evoked potentials when asking whether the images were old or young versus happy or sad. The dotted line corresponding to faces showed the largest N170 ERP in both the temporal and occipital electrode channels, as you can see in the bottom of the graph labeled. So although we expected the second block of the experiment, which was the happy or sad condition, to have greater N170 than the first block of the experiment, which was an old or young condition, this was in fact not the case, as in each the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital electrode channels, the light blue and pink lines are overlapping. Likewise, there was also no difference between the P100 evoked potentials when asking whether the images were happy or sad versus old or young. So why exactly is the case? Why do we not see a larger N170 when we prime participants to see faces rather than objects? Majority of the studies dealing with the comparison of ERPs for pareidolia and non-face stimuli to the ERPs for normal faces have shown a larger N170 for pareidolia and non-face objects than of what was seen in our experimental results. One possible explanation for this can be the fact that participants saw the same pareidolia images twice. Even though they were presented in separate paradigms or separate blocks, the fact that the images were the same could have led to a decreased N170 ERP in the happy versus sad condition, since that was shown second. A future study could be to have two groups of participants and to show them each different blocks of the experiment and compare those results. Another explanation for the lack of significant difference between the N170s in block 1 and block 2 could be that the physical features of an image, rather than how it is perceived, might be a stronger determinant of early ERP components than assumed so far. This, however, might not exactly be accurate, as one study that I looked at argued that the N170 is not increased for stimuli that are similar to faces if participants are not interpreting these stimuli as faces. So for example, in a study where participants were shown the character combination of a smiley face, a noticeable N170 response was obtained. However, when they were shown the reverse character combination, there was an extremely reduced N170 response. Because of these observations, there is some evidence that perception does play a role in determining if a visual stimulus is a face, as well as evidence that knowledge derived from experience of what is a face also plays a role. But this still leaves us with the question of why do we sometimes interpret pareidolia images as a face? Even though pareidolia images used in this study had certain shared internal features with faces, most of them did not have the global ovid shape that human faces have. This globid oval shape is one of the earliest temporal differences between faces and face pareidolia images, which may have led to the results that we obtained. Nonetheless, this is a very new area of study, and further research is still needed. Thank you.
All right, does anybody have any questions for KATELYN?
I didn't understand the graph of the time scale. When is this when the image comes up, then the time scale starts?
This graph you're talking about?
Yeah.
Can you repeat your question, please?
So the time, right? What does the time indicate? When does it start?
Okay, so the time indicates when the image is first shown on the screen. So where the vertical line is that says 0, that's when the image comes on the screen. And then, like I said, the P100, that will be 100 milliseconds after the image is shown. And then the N170 is 170 milliseconds after, like, the image is shown.
So if you blink, then you missed it, then you off sync?
No, that's why we average across all the trials. So that accounts for any discrepancies. So for example, if you blink, or like if you're not looking at the image in the first second, we have an average of all those trials and put them into one, so it takes out those discrepancies.
Let's pretend you're in an alternate universe where you were able to find a significant difference between the two plots. Instead of the conclusion that you came up with, what would we have gained if we did find a difference, if we were able to trick our brains using the old-young block 1 paradigm? Like, what would we have learned
Yeah, pareidolia. So I think if we would have saw a significant difference, it goes into further research. Like some of the articles I looked at were talking about how, how we can do studies with those that are autistic or schizophrenic. So I think if we did see a significant difference, it could contribute to studies, dealing with mental illnesses and how we can help those people that are autistic or schizophrenic in determining like how to see faces better and stuff like that. It was I guess our age range consisted from about 18 years old to about 55.
All right, well, let's give KATELYN another hand. All righty. The last presentation that we have in this first session is by Riley Houston with an honors in history, and the research involves Civil War, nurses, and the cult of true womanhood. So let's give her a hand.
How do I full screen this? There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Before I get into my presentation, I would first like to thank my advisor, Dr. Story, my second reader, Dr. Rolfe, and my third reader, Dr. McMaster, for all of their guidance on this project. I would also like to thank my friends and family, some of whom are here today, for supporting me through this process. Thank you all so much. So with that, I'm going to get into the project. I would like to first start with a story that, like a lot of interesting stories in America, started in 1861. A woman by the name of Annie Wittenmeyer, living in Iowa, began to volunteer at hospitals springing up near her home. From there, she was elected to be the sanitary agent for her state. She began to establish sanitary kitchens in various hospitals throughout the country. This very quickly became her life's pride. In her memoir, she details almost being shot in the head while on a train, standing up to a surgeon who she caught stealing coffee in the hospital, and personally seeing to it that 2,000 soldiers were transported out of a sweltering church with no water where she'd found them. And her story is just one of many that I've come to know and love over 17 months. And yeah, so my project focused on Civil War nurses and how they related to gender ideology of the 19th century. I came to this topic because I'm very interested in women's history, I'm very interested in medical history, and I'm very interested in the 19th century in general, so all three of these things kind of came together perfectly. The specific 19th century gender ideology that I focused on is a concept called the cult of true womanhood. This term was coined in the 1960s by a historian named Barbara Welter in her essay, The Cult of True Womanhood, 1820 to 1860. In this sort of specific gender ideology, it states that, a true woman embodies the four virtues of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. And as I read these stories of different nurses throughout the Civil War, I came to find that their experiences sort of directly contradicted these teachings and these virtues that women were expected to live up to. So I looked specifically into these four different virtues. So first we have piety. Piety was actually the only one that was not really contradicted. In fact, a lot of the nurses really leaned into the idea of being a religious backbone for others. You see here, Sophronia Buckland, she enlisted as a nurse in 1864 for the Union. Even though she came in very late to the war, she still witnessed a lot of carnage, a lot of suffering and dying. And she really leaned into Christianity and faith as a sort of as a crutch for herself and for the soldiers that she was taking care of. In her memoir, she details one story where she is comforting a man who's dying, and he asks her if he's going to see her in heaven someday. And she says that he will, God being her helper. So her story is not unique. There are a lot of nurses that detail in their memoirs and in their diaries, really leaning into their faith. We see Kate Cummings was a nurse for the Confederacy, and she details in her memoirs how she sort of would bully some of the soldiers into coming to church with her, and she would read the Bible to the soldiers who couldn't read and wanted her to. And this was really the one that was not contested. But as for the others, so we have purity. And of course, when they say purity, they're referring to sexual purity, which was something that was considered very important at the time for a woman. If you didn't have that, you basically didn't have anything. And one of the big issues for a lot of people with the idea of these nurses going into hospitals and being around all of these men that they don't know who are in compromising situations. Many of them were half naked, many of them were, fully naked because they'd been wounded and they needed to be taken care of. And this was just something that really horrified a lot of people. As you see here, someone wrote to one of the nurses asking if a young lady would be expected to do these sort of things. It got to the point where Dorothy Dix, basically the leader of the Sanitary Commission for the Union, which was an organization that helped oversee nurses, she made it a requirement that you had to be 35, plain, and modestly dressed to be a nurse for the Sanitary Commission. I don't think that this was due to how she personally felt. It really seemed like a reflection of her trying to nip any concerns in the bud of anything improper going on in these hospitals. So submissiveness ended up being a really big one. You see here Kate Cummings, as I said, she was a nurse for the Confederacy. She volunteered to start nursing because she heard a lot of calls for more help in the hospitals, and she felt like she could do her best to contribute in doing that. And in one of the stories in her memoir, she is discussing how she and the other nurses are about to be transported to another hospital. And the head surgeon of this hospital is really notorious for not wanting women in his hospital and not being very polite to them once they're there. And she's basically immediately ready to stand up to him and fight for her spot in the hospital, what she feels is her rightful spot, and that she deserves to be there as much as anyone else. And you see her quote here, all that she asks is to be treated with the same respect due to men, which nowadays is just, it feels like a given, it feels like a very obvious statement, but at the time it was kind of a radical statement for her to make. And she was given this empowerment through serving as a nurse, which was a trend that I noticed. A lot of these women really felt like they had their reasons for standing up to the surgeons because they were standing up not only for themselves but for the soldiers in their care. A lot of them really felt like those were their boys and that they had to be their advocates. One story, Annie Wittenmeyer, I had mentioned, she found out that one of the surgeons had been stealing coffee to sell and cutting the remaining coffee with wood chips. The soldier started complaining to her about the taste, and she found that out, and she immediately marched to the first authority she could find and basically insisted on dragging this man to the police herself. She was very ready to fight for the men under her care. And as I said, she was given this empowerment through serving as a nurse. So domesticity, this one was interesting because on the surface, nursing and taking care of someone seems like a very traditionally feminine and domestic task. But it was really different in the context of the Civil War. You have thousands of women going into hospitals, some of them for pay. They were contract nurses, and then there were volunteer nurses as well. But they had a job to do, and they understood that this was a job, this was a service that they were performing, and it was in service of a greater cause. A lot of these women were really aligned with whichever cause they were serving, whether it was Union or Confederate. And it was really a completely different world from the home that they would have been used to. As you see here, the quote from Cornelia Hancock, feeling like her past life was a myth. She was a very interesting story to read. She was very young. I want to say she was 23. And she was much younger than, she was a nurse for the Union, and she was much younger than the requirements for the Sanitary Commission. and she was desperate to help in any way she could, so she just kind of boarded a train when Dorothy Dix wasn't looking, and nobody told her to get off, so she just stayed on. And she ended up nursing for all 4 years of the war, and then afterwards moved south to teach free black children how to read and write, and really dedicated the rest of her life to service. And again, she was not unique in this either. A lot of women really went on to go into service afterwards because they were really inspired by the time that they'd served. So rather than feeling like they were fulfilling a purpose through marriage or motherhood, a lot of them started getting fulfillment from the idea of performing a service, of being important to their country. And this was really a shift in attitudes. So the focus that I ended up narrowing down into, Northern versus Southern women, I ended up focusing more on Union women, simply because there was a lot more data. There were many more memoirs, published letters for the Union nurses. Obviously, they were more organized than the Confederate nurses were. For the Confederacy, it was usually on a volunteer basis. I still included some women from the Confederacy, but as it all came down to it, ended up being much more on the Union side. When it came to class, I ended up focusing mostly on middle to upper class women, simply because they were the ones more likely to have really front and center positions in these hospitals. Annie Wittenmeyer, who I keep coming back to, she was not just a volunteer nurse, she was a sanitary agent. She was in charge of helping the kitchens and going to different hospitals and checking up on soldiers. And it was the women who were middle to upper class who really had the connections to do this. And a lot of them could afford to do this. You know, if you were a working class woman and you maybe had children at home, or you had to be putting food on the table, you couldn't just go off and volunteer to nurse for months at a time. So that ended up being a focus as well. And race also ended up being a focus. Obviously, the women that I showed you to this point have all been white women. You notice a trend in it usually being white women who had memoirs published and who had letters published afterwards. But that is not to say that there were no black nurses. There were a lot of black nurses that served both the Union and the Confederacy. In fact, one of the memoirs that I did read was by Susie King Taylor. She was a free woman in the Union. She nursed during the war. Her husband was a soldier, and she wrote her memoir about that. And the way that black women fit into the cult of true womanhood. Obviously, the cult of true womanhood is aimed towards middle and upper class white women, sort of teaching them this is how to be, you know, a Christian American woman. And the way that you usually see black women fitting into this is this really offensive, like Scarlett O'Hara dynamic of black women serving white women. But during the war, you see a lot of black nurses are working in these hospitals alongside white women, and it really broke down some of these barriers. Obviously, there was still a lot of inequality that happened in these hospitals, but for the most part, you still see, even in the South, you see black women working alongside white women in these hospitals on a more equal footing. And you see here in Susie King Taylor's memoir that it really gave her a sense of empowerment to be able to be a part of history in this way. And she asserts that it wasn't just her, there were hundreds of women like her who did this. And near the end of her memoir, she details an experience where she's basically kicked out of a train compartment because she's not allowed to be there. And the first thing that she thinks of is how she and her husband have served this country and how they don't deserve this treatment. So she really derives a sense of empowerment of I am an American due to the service that she's provided. So other things that I also ended up focusing on were friendships that the nurses had with the soldiers that they were tending to, kind of in opposite of what people had been worried about, of things being improper in these hospitals. A lot of these women really had a sense of camaraderie with the soldiers under their care. They bonded with them, they talked to them, they often referred to them as their brothers, and the soldiers sometimes referred to them as their sisters, and it was really sort of an equalizing friendship that broke down some of these barriers between men and women at the time. One that I really focused on was hospital conditions and the myth of women being delicate. A lot of gender ideology at the time really focused on the fact that women were incapable of doing things, of the idea of women being too delicate, which really tied into the idea of their purity. But the idea of women being too delicate to handle the same things that men could handle was kind of undermined when you see these women going into hospitals and witnessing men having their limbs amputated and men suffering from infections and illnesses, and they were up close and personal with all of this and dealing with it hands-on. And a lot of them, I think, kind of acknowledged themselves that, hey, I can do this. They didn't faint the minute that they walked into the hospital or anything like women had been depicted for so long. Politics was another big one. It was considered very improper for a woman to be involved in politics, to be political back then. But because they were up close and personal with the war and they were really serving their country, whichever side they were fighting for, and they really ended up aligning themselves with the causes more. And you see in a lot of their memoirs them being political. Kate Cummings in particular is the first one that really comes to mind. As I said, she was a Confederate, and in her memoirs, she really spends a lot of time talking about the politics of the Civil War as she sees it. She talks about secession and specific Union politicians that she has issues with and all of this other stuff. She even spends one chapter talking about how she feels like General Lee could be doing a better job and implementing this strategy instead. And it's really funny to see. Because in another chapter, she literally states that, like, she thinks it's disgusting when other women are political. She spent so much of her book being political. It's very funny. And then finally, the fight for pensions was something that I focused on. After the war, a lot of union nurses see union soldiers, union veterans receiving pensions for performing service for their country. And a lot of these women start requesting that they also receive pensions because they've also provided a service for their country, one that was dangerous. A lot of women narrowly avoided being hit during battles right outside the tents. A lot of women got sick because of the diseases that went through the hospitals. And a lot of women did end up receiving pensions, but they had to fight for them. And this is really notable because they weren't just acknowledging to themselves that they had performed an important service, they were demanding that the government and the rest of the country acknowledge that they had performed an important service for their country and that they had contributed to history in such a way. So all in all, it basically comes down to how Civil War nursing, even though it on the surface appears like it would fall into the status quo, and even Barbara Welter in her essay discussing the cult of domesticity mentions nursing as fitting into the status quo. But if you actually read the experiences of these women, they really stepped outside of the status quo and went against all of the virtues that they had been raised being told that they had to embody. Their own lived experiences in being nurses broke away from this, whether they realized it or not. I think most of them didn't realize really that they were rebelling in any way. But if you read their stories and they read the way that they talk about it, it really is an act of rebellion, and it's important to acknowledge. So, thank you so much.
All righty, does anybody have any questions for Riley?
Yes.
How many nurses were, potential nurses were turned away from being too good looking?
So that actually wasn't really something that got enforced a lot. Dix had asserted that they had to be over 35, but in fact there were a lot of nurses that were under 35, especially as the war went on and things got more dire and desperate. They really couldn't afford to be picky, so that wasn't really something that was that enforced. Yeah, I do feel like women, specifically these nurses as well, made a big impact, because without them, I think that they were the cause of a lot of hospitals being a lot better than they could have been. I think that they really advocated for the soldiers under their care in a way that a lot of the surgeons who weren't as up close and personal with them. Yeah, I feel like they saved a lot of lives, not only through their medical intervention, but through their intervention on behalf of the soldiers.
Riley, what longer-term opportunities did this create for women?
Yeah, I think that this really helped to destigmatize the idea of women going out and doing things like this. Before this, I mean, the amount of women that went out and nursed just would have been unheard of. I mean, you have a lot of women leaving home traveling alone for the first time. Louisa May Alcott writes a lot in her memoir about how excited she was to travel alone. I think it really broke down a lot of barriers that were holding women back in this way. Yeah, I just think it was really a catalyst for social change as well as like professional change and making it easier for women to work.
Anyone else? Yes.
Did you, I don't know if you looked at this, but do you know if there are any like parallels to nursing today, or how this would have affected the field of nursing, more than just being able to go out like you just said?
Yeah, so the medical developments that happened because of this were really notable. I wish that I'd had more time to research them more. I really focused on the social aspect. But just like the medical developments and sort of the role that a nurse plays in the hospital, I feel were kind of developed a little bit more during the Civil War. You start seeing more cleanliness, more nutritional needs being met. Specifically, Annie Wittenmeyer was really harped on soldiers getting enough nutrition. And I think that just like the well-being of the patient, other than just making sure they don't die, really started to be focused on more.
Did these nurses get any sort of recognition for what they did? Did any politicians stand up and say, that was well done? Or were they just sort of left to wander through history?
Yeah, so there was definitely some recognition. There's a book titled Part Taken by Women in American History, and there's this big chapter on nurses, and it came out not long after the war. There were several books published after the war sort of wanting to recognize these women. And then outside of that, there was the movement for pensions, and a lot of people were on their side. There were people who hadn't been nurses who were asserting on behalf of them that they deserved to receive pensions the same way that soldiers did. So there definitely was some recognition, probably not as much as there could have been, but there definitely was some right after the war, for the Union especially.
That's what they should have.
Okay, time for one more, if there's any last one. If not, then let's give Riley some more time. Alrighty, so that is the end of our first session. Thank you to all four of you who presented and did such a beautiful job. We're gonna have about a 20-minute break until 2:40 when our next session will start. So like Dr. Rice said, feel free for some refreshments out there. Go stretch your legs, go to the bathroom, whatever you need, and we'll come back in here right before 12:40 and get started.
Hello, everyone. Are we ready to get started with session 2? Awesome. So my name is Rose Ward, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm glad to see you guys all here, and I hope you're excited to hear some more great presentations. A quick note to the presenters, if needed at the 15-minute mark, I will raise my hand for you. I'll be to your right, about on the 3rd row, so keep an eye out if needed. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Our first presentation will be from Samantha Sherman with an honors in biochemistry. Her research is titled, Developing an Assay for Quantifying Substrate Specificity of Antiporter Proteins in Lipid Membranes. So everyone, please welcome Samantha.
Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be talking about my research in developing an assay for measuring substrate specificity in antiporter proteins. So E. coli is a gram-negative bacteria that's naturally found in the intestine. Usually it's not a problem, but some strains like the enterohemorrhagic strains can cause things like bloody diarrhea and even, in the worst case scenario, death. So it's transmitted by the oral fecal route, which is usually from things like food contamination and not washing your hands. And so one of the ways that we can protect ourselves is by preserving our food so that it makes it hard for bacteria to survive. So for example, we have pickles. We preserve pickles in vinegar, which is acidic, and then the salt in brine causes osmotic stress to the bacteria, making it harder to survive. And another stressor for E. coli is the very low pH of our stomachs in order to get to our intestines. So one of the things E. coli has done is evolved to have strategies so that it can combat these challenges in different ways. One of these ways is by creating an acid-resistant system. And part of this acid-resistant system, a big contributor of it is membrane transport proteins, which live in, essentially are in the, I don't know if you can see that. Yep, the cytoplasmic membrane of E. coli. And this sort of helps control what goes in and out of the cell. So in our lab, we've been studying how to measure substrate specificity. And in particular, we've been studying a protein in E. coli called YHGX, which you'll find more about from Nazim Rahat's presentation tomorrow. There's not very much known about it, but what we do know is that it responds to acid stress. The E. coli responds by making more of this protein, and because this protein is a transport protein, we think it could possibly function in acid resistance. So the way that it would theoretically work is you have two very specific substrates which don't pass through this lipid bilayer inside and outside the cell. But with this protein, it allows these very specific substrates to pass on either side at the same time. The only problem with this, with YHJX, is that we don't know for sure what it transports. So really quickly, there are a couple of different types of membrane transport proteins. One of them is a uniporter, which transports one substance across the membrane. Another is a symporter, which transports two substrates across the membrane in the same direction. And then an antiporter is sort of special because it transports two substrates across the membrane in opposite directions. So for my project, I wanted to use a pretty well-researched antiporter protein, so I chose the GAD-C system in E. coli, and we know that this transports glutamate and GABA, which stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid. It imports glutamate and exports GABA. And one of the issues when trying to perform these tests is actually, how do we see this? So what most researchers do now is use a technique called radiolabeling. So if we look at this liposome here, right here, say we take a substrate like GABA and we label it with a radioactive atom. Let's say that's these little blue dots inside this liposome. And then if we say that there's an antiporter protein like GAD-C inside this membrane right here, and there's glutamate on the outside of the liposome. Then you run the assay, and then you look on the outside of the liposome, and if there is radioactivity there, then we know that that antiporter is specific for those substances. So we had the idea to create this assay method that would help measure substrate specificity in a different way. That's a little bit safer because there are some safety concerns with having radioactive chemicals in the lab and doing that sort of thing. So our idea was to develop some kind of apparatus with, it would have a divider in the middle with Teflon tape, and then the divider itself has a hole in it, and you would pierce that hole, a hole into the Teflon tape, and then once you have that hole, that's where you build your synthetic membrane, and then you load your protein that you have in there, and then on either side of your apparatus, you have the two different substances, and then you can measure the transport that way. So our first step was to design a chamber, and we decided to 3D print our chamber. Our first prototype is this elaborate design. In the middle, there was a divider that had a hole in it, and the idea was that you could take it out and build your synthetic membrane on top of there, and then put it back in. They also had these viewports on the sides of them that you could look in and see kind of what's going on from that level. But there were some issues, including leaking, so we then looked at prototype 2, which has 2 identical cells, so this one and then another one that looks just like it, and it sort of acts as a hinge. There would be a pin that would go through that cylinder at the bottom that would help it act as a hinge so that you can open it up and then take out the Teflon tape and build your synthetic membrane that way. However, this method didn't work as well on the 3D printer, so we ended up going with the simplest version of what we had thought we were going to do. There's no viewports, but it is on a flat surface, and it would be held together by an elastic band, which this is the final product. And so our first step in testing to see if this chamber really works is to perform an assay where we can really see what's going on. So here we have Allura red dye, and so I loaded the stir cell on the top with dye, and then you can see it moving across the cell to the receiving cell as the liquid in there gets more red. Concentration of dye increases over time. So we know that that was successful. So the next step would be to bring in the actual substrates that we're going to use, which would be glutamic acid and then GABA separately. So first, with the glutamic acid assay, I loaded the stir cell with 100 millimolar concentration of glutamic acid and then measured its concentration from the receiving cell at different times. So I measure the concentration via LCMS. LCMS is liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. And as you can see on the bottom left, this chromatogram is called a calibration curve. It's a curve of standard concentrations of glutamic acid. It's a range of them from about 5 to 100 ppm. So we can compare these peaks at this retention time to the peaks that we see from our assay. And so what we can see at this time is that these peaks are less intense than what we see in the standard, but they are still there, so proves that glutamic acid did transfer to the other cell. And then we also performed this assay with GABA. With this assay, we also saw detected GABA at slightly stronger intensities than we saw from the glutamic acid. So since that worked, our next step was to actually construct the synthetic bilayer. So the way that we did that was we used this method called the folding method, and there are a couple of steps to it. So I have my apparatus, my chamber right here, and essentially, I don't know if you can see it, but essentially you have an aqueous solution. You have the aqueous solution in both cells above the layer of the aperture or the hole in between, and then you pour a lipid solution on top of one of the cells. And then the second step is that you remove some of that aqueous solution from the bottom so that the lipid membrane or the lipid layer moves across that aperture, and that would create one monolayer. And then the next step would be to reload that same cell with more aqueous solution so that the lipid layer or the level of the lipid solution passed over the aperture again, and then that would spontaneously form that lipid bilayer there. So to test this method, we conducted another assay with red dye, and this time we wanted to make sure that the red dye did not pass to the other cell, that the lipid membrane kept the red dye on one side of the cell. So this is what our completed assay looked like. And then after the assay was completed, to make sure that we didn't just block it with some other thing, we washed it with chloroform, which would dissolve the lipid membrane. So then you would see the red dye moving into the other chamber, so you can confirm that that was the lipid bilayer. So now that we've done these preliminary experiments, it looks like the membrane's ready to go. So our next step would be to express our protein and then insert it into the membrane. So we designed a plasmid that would express the protein, and then we also designed primers to clone GAD-C from the E. coli genomic DNA, and then inserted the gene into the expression plasmid. We confirmed our construct by Sanger sequencing, as you can see at the bottom. And then we transformed the expression strain of E. coli cells with the plasmid that we created. And then we grew a culture of that, induced it, harvested the cells, and then analyzed the products by SDS page. And as you can see at the bottom left, this is the SDS page. And an overexpression would be denoted by a dark band at around 67 for GAD-C. And we did not observe a dark band here, so that indicates that there was not expression at detectable levels for GAD-C. There are other ways that we can optimize this process and this protocol. So even though we weren't able to express our protein, we were able to have a proof of concept that this assay will work if the protein is expressed and inserted into the membrane. So constructed the chamber and ran tests for it. So in the end, future work would be to run the assay with glutamate and GABA, and then to possibly work with other proteins such as YHJX. So in the end, we created a safer and more accessible way to measure substrate specificity. So thank you to the honors program and my advisors, Dr. Toyota, Dr. Ward, and Dr. Franey, as well as Dr. Ward and his lab for their help with the LCMS, and Nazam, Rahat, and Connor Henderson, my lab partners, for helping me.
So does anyone have any questions for Samantha?
Yeah, I'm a little bit intrigued that GABA and glutamate are exchanged, because it turns out that they are also the most prevalent neurotransmitters in the brain, one being used for excitatory signals and the other for inhibitory. Is it a coincidence?
I'm not sure, because I studied more of their purposes for E. coli and bacteria more in particular, but I think that is really interesting.
Yeah, I was just curious because we have hundreds of different neurotransmitters, and exactly the two that are used most of all in the brain, those are the two that are exchanged balances.
Yes.
So it's kind of,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else have a question? Let's give another round of applause to Samantha. next presentation will be from ISABEL BAIRD with an honors in neuroscience. Her research is titled Novel Peptide Signaling Systems of the Cochlea Protective Against Noise-Induced Structural Damage and Physiological Dysfunction. I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint for you. Thank you very much, girl. Let's give her a round of applause.
Hello, everybody. I'm ISABEL BAIRD. I am doing my project on novel peptide signaling systems of the cochlea, protective against noise-induced structural damage and physiological dysfunction, which is kind of a fancy way of saying that there is a signaling system in the cochlea that might be the key to preserving our hearing and reducing noise-induced hearing loss. So, first we need to do a little bit of background. So, how do we hear? I'm going to walk you through how we hear. So the first step is in the outer ear. Our sound will enter the ear canal and touch on the tympanic membrane, which is colloquially known as the eardrum. And that's right there. And the second part is the middle ear, and that is where the vibration from the tympanic membrane will stimulate the malleus, incus, and stapes, which are the ossicles, those small bones inside the ear. And the stapes will eventually tap on that oval window and create vibrations in the cochlear fluid, and then that's the middle ear. And the cochlear fluid will stimulate the basilar membrane of the cochlea. So once this fluid moves, the hair cells on this basilar membrane, which is right here circled, those will start going back and forth like this, and because they are mechanoreceptors, those outer hair cells will cause an action potential that will be created, and the ganglion cells, which are right here, are going to be depolarized at the organ of Corti, and then the signal is sent to the brain for interpretation down there. So, now that we know how we hear, roughly, we're going to talk about when it's too loud. So noise-induced hearing loss explained. So here is an image of some healthy hair cells and some damaged hair cells inside the cochlea. So obviously you can tell that whenever they're damaged, they're not going to be able to wave back and forth, and so that's going to significantly reduce the ability of those hair cells to send an action potential that will get to the brain and be able to interpret the sound. So when any of the steps in the hearing process are disrupted or the delicate hair cells are damaged, this can result in hearing problems and even deafness. So hair cells do not regenerate in humans, so this is why another reason that the research is very important is because once you lose them, you lose them. You don't have any more hearing. So something called a temporary threshold shift may occur whenever you are initially exposed to traumatic loud noise. And a temporary threshold shift is when your ears are temporarily not as sensitive to the sound that you're hearing. For a brief amount of time, actually the time can be from days to weeks to hours, but the point is that it will eventually return to baseline. So we're going to talk about how can we tell that it has occurred and how can we treat it. So we already talked a little bit about the temporary threshold shift and indication of temporary noise-induced hearing loss. One of the examples that I like to use is going into a movie, and when you're watching that movie, for 2 hours, it's really loud, and you come out and your ears feel like there's kind of cotton in there. And so that will probably persist for maybe 30 minutes or an hour, however long, but eventually your hearing will return back to baseline. So that's an example of a temporary threshold shift. But the opposite of that is a permanent threshold shift and permanent noise-induced hearing loss. And this can be anywhere from one really loud sound to continuous exposure to a loud sound, and this is when your cannot, the permanent noise-induced hearing loss, there's the hair cells are completely damaged, so you will never return back to baseline. So there are a couple of previous treatment methods besides the CRF pathway manipulation that I will be talking about later. The most well-known is obviously earplugs. But there are some pharmacological methods as well. There is some experimental therapy in using neurotrophins, which are these kind of neural stem cells that are working on actually repairing the ribbon cell synapses of the hair cells. And there's also another very kind of similar utilization of a corticotropin system in the ear where there's an intratympanic dexamethasone injection that you can get. That is kind of like a local injection into the inner ear that is supposed to die down the inflammation. So now we're going to talk about the aim of my research. So it is determining whether a family of receptors that have been located in the cochlea called corticotropin releasing factor receptors 1 and 2 participate in noise-induced hearing loss, and additionally, if they do participate in this noise-induced hearing loss, whether the inhibition of this receptor will alter cochlear response in noise-induced or noise-exposed mice, with hopes to reveal a new drug target to prevent this noise-induced hearing loss. But how are we going to do it? This is how we will do it, my experimental design. So in the lab, some mice were exposed to traumatic loud noise for 2 hours at 105 decibels from a frequency of 8 to 16 kilohertz. And this group of mice was divided into 2 different groups. One group was the mice that were injected with antilarmin. Antilarmin is a CRF antagonist, which means that once it binds to that CRF receptor, it prevents or inhibits the stimulation of that receptor and will, in turn, reduce the inflammation. So these mice were exposed to the antilarmin, which is supposed to kind of like neutralize the CRF effect. And the other mice were given a saline placebo injection, which is just serving as our control. When these mice are given the saline, it doesn't do anything to the CRF receptors. They continue to work as normal. So both of these mice, after 7 days, they were immunostained, which means that we harvested the cochleas and we did some slicing and we went ahead and put these fluorescent stains on the tissue and looked under the microscope. And the 2 stains that we used were CD68, which is a broad marker for macrophages and mononuclear phagocytes, and IBA1, which is more of a subset of macrophages. So after this, we did some statistical analysis, which involved cell counting. So we counted up how many CD68 positive cells were in the tissue and how many IBA1 positive cells were in the tissue. So we used specific regions for cell counting. We divided them up to determine immune cell activation hotspots in the cochlea. And so here are 2 pictures that I used actually when I was counting the cells. Not all of these sections are important, but the 2 most important sections for this research specifically is number 3, which is the ganglion cell over here. And the ganglion cell actually is where you're going to find a lot of, like a variety of leukocytes, particularly macrophages. And then number 6, which is the cochlear nerve axon, which is where you'll actually find also some pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are signals that are released by leukocytes there that are calling more leukocytes in. So here are some results. This is a count that we did based on the turns of the cochlea. So if you look at the cochlea cross-sectioned, you can see that it kind of resembles a triangle. And the apex is at the top, and these basal levels are at the bottom here. And so for our research, we did a count of the whole cochlea, and we did a count of each turn. So we have the apex turns are here, the mid, the first mid, and the second mid, and then the base. And so we found that the lower, middle, and basal turns of this cochlea will show the most significant difference in immune response or immune activation. So something interesting to look at is that the CD68, when given saline, they're much higher levels and with that dark blue. And then whenever the CD68 with antilarmin was counted up, you can see that there was a drastic drop. And it was actually statistically significant, as you can see. Oops. Okay. So here are some other results divided up by region. Because we are in the preliminary stages of this research, we don't have enough data to really say for certain that division by region is very important. So these results are not extremely official. But one thing I did want to draw attention to was how IBA1 in this number 3 right here, the antilarmin mice actually had a higher amount of cells. And something that was interesting about this is that IBA1 is more of a resident macrophage marker, so it'll fluoresce the macrophages that are actually there in the tissue regardless of immune activity. So this was a good marker to say that most of these cells that are being reduced by antilarmin are not the resident macrophages. But over here in CD68, which is much broader, you can see that there is a reduction, a slight reduction in number 3 and a larger reduction in number 6. So you can tell that with the influx of leukocytes that are coming in, there's not as much of an influx whenever you have the antilarmin present. So there is some reduction in immune response, as we talked about, when administered antilarmin, but it's more significant in the CD68 immunostain. So some reasons for inconsistencies in the counts could be that these cells, whenever they become activated, they actually assume less of a spherical shape and more of an amoeboid shape, which is where they're trying, there's a projection of the cytoplasm, and it's kind of like they're going towards their signal, like there's a beacon where the inflammation is occurring and those cells are traveling towards the beacon. And so that makes it a little bit harder to define the edges of the cell, and so whenever you're counting by eye, it's a little bit more difficult to categorize where one cell ends and the other cell begins. So here's some conclusions that we can draw from this experiment and some next steps. So there is a statistically verifiable decrease in immune system activation, indicated by the decreased total number of CD68 cells in the middle and basal cochlear turns. So in future studies, we want to focus on doing further counting because this is pretty preliminary, and more counting will help narrow the window of error. And we want to also amplify the results that we have by administering more antilarmin in the days after noise. And in the the much later future, we want to determine whether giving antilarmin or a stressin, which is a similar treatment to antilarmin, before noise exposure as opposed to after noise exposure, could that be a viable way of manipulating the CRFR signaling system to defend against noise-induced hearing loss? So why should you care about this? I've just been standing up here and, you're just kind of like, how does this apply to me? So hopefully we can develop a mechanism using this research to reduce or prevent noise-induced hearing loss by manipulation of this CRF pathway. And eventually there may be a preventative medication on the market for reducing noise-induced hearing loss in the very far future. So I wanted to include also this map right here, which is, it looks kind of like a light pollution map, but it's actually a noise pollution map. So all of these places where it's kind of darker, you're going to see those are like 20 to 30 decibels of background noise that's present even if the room is silent. And so that 20 decibel would be more of like a whisper. And up here where you're gonna see the yellow, that's gonna be 58 to 64 decibels, and that's around normal conversation. But what's interesting is that whenever that is drawn out and present constantly, that's actually damaging your hearing. So this does apply to you, and I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Does anyone have any questions for Isabel?
More comments, not so much questions about it. So I'm trying to envision the experimental setup with the mice, because the description I thought was very, very interesting about their exposure to the noise. It's like traumatic noise.
Yes.
And so I'm imagining, I'm glad that you shared the decibel scale on it also, because I think it's 105 decibels. That was
Mm-hmm.
playing like a Metallica concert or something like that. What was the noise exposure that the mice were exposed to prior to doing the different putting them in the
Sure. So it was actually kind of interesting. We could only expose a couple of mice at a time because you didn't want them to get on top of each other and then have an inconsistent amount of noise exposure. So we would put like maybe 3 in this handmade cage of like chicken wire, I guess, and they were put into this kind of like also sort of handmade noise chamber with a microphone that kind of came down from the ceiling, and it projected that noise. And the noise wasn't anything like particular. It was just kind of like almost like a white noise, but it was 105 decibels. But they were exposed to that for exactly 2 hours, and then they were taking it out. And
a follow-up question is more just out of curiosity, so I just talked about this in zoology, but I don't know a lot about it. With the noise-induced hearing loss, with the damage to the hair cells, is the damage to the hair cells, is that purely like just from the mechanical, constant exposure to like a really strong, powerful, what causes the damage to the hair cells themselves?
so initially that could be it, but also when immune cells hang around and stay around for a while, a lot of times that stress can influence, like it can start breaking down parts of the ear that it's not supposed to break down. So that's why like at 7 days, it's actually at a peak of immune cell activation, and that's why we harvest the cochleas at 7 days. But it continues to be destructive even after that inflammation doesn't have to be there. So that's why we're trying to reduce the inflammation in the ear.
Do we have anyone else have another question for Isabel?
So I don't know the huge difference between genetic mice and humans, but do you think that there would be a difference in the hair cells between mice and humans?
There very well could be some differences, but the reason that we used mice, and mice are continuously used in labs, is because a lot of the features of those mice are pretty similar to those in humans and like pretty comparable. So that's why we're pretty sure that it's going to be okay.
Let's give Isabel another round of applause. So our next presentation will be from Lindsey Howard with an honors in geoscience. With her research, geophysical investigation of faults associated with the Mariana paleoliquefaction. So please welcome Lindsey to the stage.
So yes, like Rose said, I'm Lindsey. So let's get started. First off, I wanted to just do a couple acknowledgments and thank yous to some people and some land access agreements that we were able to get, and some people who were able to help me, especially Dr. Harris with this entire process. Has been amazing, and Dr. DICKIE and Dr. Bernay for being my second and third readers, and Alex in the honors program for just being able to fund this and do everything that I've gotten to do, as well as the Sorrells Geophysics Fellowship funding that fielded some of my research, and being able to travel and go to New Orleans to present my research this past December, which was a lot of fun. So just a little bit of a background to kind of give you all an idea of where we're looking at. This is a map of the kind of like mid-Mississippi embayment kind of area. If you can see Memphis on there, this pointer doesn't work very well. Memphis kind of in the middle right side of the page. Is kind of where you're looking at, and like I said, this area is in the central Mississippi Valley, and my specific study area, if you go down a little bit further, is called the Daytona Beach Lineament. So some of the things you're seeing on this diagram, the green dots are active seismic earthquakes within the past several years. Bigger ones, of course, are a little bit higher on the Richter magnitude scale, and so those are inconsistent with the feature called the Reelfoot Rift up in the top left, kind of trending towards the northeast. And then down in the bottom, all the red lines you see are some previous studied fault zones, like the Big Creek Fault Zone, the White River Fault Zone, and things like that. So my study area, you can see, is called the Daytona Beach Lineament, and it clusters around these red dots that you see, which are paleoliquefaction features. So a little bit about paleoliquefaction. So let's say you have a bucket of sand and you put some water in it. Sand holds water pretty well, but those grains are still going to touch each other. If you expose that bucket to like really large shaking, the water gets more around each one of those little grains and becomes more liquefied. Same thing happens on a much greater scale when it comes to the earth, and so you get this giant shaking of the ground due to an earthquake, mainly a magnitude 6 or greater on the Richter magnitude scale. That water encompasses all around those grains, becomes more liquefied, it finds some sort of event of sorts or crack in the ground, and it is able to make its way to the surface and make a sand volcano of sorts. So that is how we were able to find this study area due to these surface expressions of these sand blows on, of these paleoliquefaction features. These are normally not super deep, maybe around 10 meters into the ground, so pretty shallow. So again, all of these red dots that you see are these paleoliquefaction features of these sand blows, and you're able to see them and find them via tonal lineaments on aerial photographs and such, which we'll see a little bit later. So there's been several investigations that we kind of built my study upon and trying to see the different ways in which other people have previously studied this area. Some reasons for this are due to what is the current seismic hazard? Is there a future seismic hazard? What has been in the past? And trying to map those different things and what could be and what has been. So the Memphis area is kind of known for the New Madrid fault zone. It's kind of a large fault zone that many people have known, but many of these faults that you see in red here are a little bit lesser known, but still important to study to see if things have moved or changed or how the stress field has shifted, which you can see in the bottom right in the corner there. The current stress field today is a transpressional type movement. And so the type of research that we wanted to do, depending on what we've seen in the past, was an SH wave seismic reflection method, which is a geophysical method. There's two that you could do, SH wave and P wave. The benefit with shear wave research is that it is almost invisible to water. It doesn't lose any of its velocity when it goes through water. You're able to still get those waves propagating through and hitting those boundaries that we want to see. It has greater resolution than P-wave, but it doesn't go quite as deep, and so my research was trying to get it as close to the surface as possible. So, and this is not from my study, this is just an example of one of the shot gathers of some of this shear wave reflection. The resolution, you could get to about 1.3 meters. In my study, I got to about 0.5 meter to 1 meter resolution, so even greater than that, so that was really impressive. So just some other, I won't go into this super deep, but some other research that has been done in the past. This was on the Big Creek Fault Zone, which is near where I did my study. The thing to point out here is just some of the major deformation. So what you're looking at here is for example, if you have a cake and you cut it in half and you're looking at the side of the cake and you can see the layers in it, that's kind of what you're looking at here, only slightly messier. But you can see those dips and turns and everything like that, those faults of how the ground has been broken there. And so that's just some things to look at there. Same thing with the Kingstown lineament. This layer of the subsurface that you're looking at has some significant faults with some ground penetrating radar shot on top of it by a student back in 2019, very, very much near the Daytona Beach lineament. So now you get a little bit closer to where my study is. So in the, where you see this dashed line, the Daytona Beach lineament, you can see some of these sand blows along the way. It's a tonal lineament. And anytime in the world that you see, or at least in geology, you see something linear, you either know it's geological or it was man-made. Nature doesn't tend to like lines and things like that. So that's why we knew something was there. So back in 2016, the USGS saw this and decided they wanted to see if there was anything to be notable. So they did some, on the bottom diagram here, they did some seismic data as well, but theirs was significantly deeper, starting at about, you can see maybe 100 to 1,500 meters below the surface, so much, much deeper. But they were able to see some of these great faults. A student that did an honors project back in the department in 2017, Michael Rohr, he thought that it would be a smart idea to go back over with the USGS shot and see if we could bring that deformation even closer to the surface. And he was able to do that, brought it up to about 5 to 10 meters below the surface. And he also shot some ground penetrating radar over the top. And the goal of my project was to see if we could bring this up even further to the surface, maybe further define what his data showed, and go from there. So the USGS P-wave profile that was at the bottom image of the slide before was across Highway 243. They shot 2 lines, F2 and F1. Michael Rohr went back over the F2 line right here using S-wave and GPR profile. And that F2, since it crosses the Daytona Beach lineament right there, was was very intriguing for me to go back over one more time. So this is where this study takes place. And these are the 2 lines I shot. They are about 200 meters each, directly east-west and then directly north-south. One was directly on the side of Highway 243. Everybody's stopping and asking if their house was going to shake from an earthquake. It was really funny. And then the other one was shot on a turn row on a farmer's field. You can't tell in this picture, but when we did it, it was all corn. And it was being irrigated. So again, with the SH waves being invisible to water, it really helped due to the ground might have been wet at that time. So this is what we decided to do to actually take the data to get what we thought would be best. I'll show you some pictures that'll make a little bit more sense. But we had a 48 channel spread of our receivers. So you'd rotate them, you'd set them out, rotate them for 200 meters. One took 1 day, one took 2 days, so not super long period of time. But it was nice to get out there and actually take some of the data. So in order to take this data, you have a steel I-beam and a hammer with a cord connected to it. And you hit it, and it'll send the seismic waves into the ground that these receivers will take and put into a program and shoot out some shot profiles. So that's me in my little tent. And then that's William Weber hitting the hammer because I was too weak to do it, so I left that to him and Dr. Harris. So that was us doing all of those things. And that is one of the geophones. They're horizontally polarized, so you hit it in, I'll go back to this one. So you're hitting it in line with the geophone. And then, oh, whoops, wrong way. And then this was our seismograph that we used, the recording system. We actually had 2. One was at the beginning, and then one was in the middle. And then we would leapfrog them and rotate them over. This was kind of like our little doghouse of sorts, and then one of the shot gatherers in the field. The reason I wanted to include this picture right here is because you can see that there's a drainage ditch on the side of, this is the Hink 2 line, the north-south line. That calls for a little bit of some surface wave to propagate through the spread that we didn't have during Hink 1. So it caused a little bit more of processing to be necessary once we got into the lab, but it was nothing that I couldn't handle. And this is it looks like a bunch of gibberish, but it's a very normal process for how to start processing the data. What I spent most of my time on was the trace kills and edits, going through each of the shot gatherers, seeing if there was anything that seemed a little off or of sorts that needed to be deleted. The program does a great job of canceling out noise because you hit each one 5 times. So if there's any discrepancies, it just kind of takes it out. But you never have a perfect one. So some editing was necessary. And then I spent most of my time on the velocity analysis, which is necessary for when you're trying to decide what type of velocity to put in. It's kind of complicated, but I don't want to explain it too much because I'm going to run over time. But I'll try to show you this one. So these are 2 examples of my shot gatherers from Hink 1 and Hink 2. So for velocity analysis and for SH wave reflection surveys, you're looking at these hyperbolic curves that you can kind of see that match up in each of those. So for velocity analysis, you would grab the beginning and end of one of those curves, and you can see on the side it tells you the depth in milliseconds of how long it took that wave to get down there, and then the top you're looking at meters. So in this way, you're able to tell the computer exactly what kind of velocity and average it is taking time to get to each of those boundaries. So once you do all that fun data stuff, you get back to your layer cake type thing, your very messy layer cake, but the data was still good for what it is. So here you're looking at Hink 1 and Hink 2, uninterpreted and interpreted profiles. So just a few things to point out here. The blue line is a boundary in the clay layer that goes down to about 5 feet, the reflection, so that way that energy that you're generating from hitting the steel plate is going down, bouncing off of that layer because it finds something hard to bounce off of and comes back to your geophone and records it. And then you have the red layer and the orange layer. Of course, there's some other layers in there, but those are the ones that I was most confident about. And then the really fun stuff are these faults that you see. So normally when you think of a fault, you might think of like a clean break. That is in solid like bedrock of sorts. This is real gooey gumbo unconsolidated sediment, so it gets a little messy at times and tends to break up into these other spreads that you can see. And what this structure that you're seeing here is called is a flower structure. And I grabbed these models from the USGS. So when you have these unconsolidated sediments that are in a transpressional type stress field, you get this positive flower structure model because it kind of looks like a flower that's blooming up top. You can get negative flower structure models if you have it in a different orientation, like you can see in figure A on the left side. But with the analysis that I did, you can see that in HINC2 profile, the blue reflection line is pushed upward, which made me to believe that it was a positive flower structure in that case. Again, very loose, unconsolidated, like silty clay things, so not the cleanest of breaks, but you still get to see some faults in this. And so to put it all together into something that can be interpreted, you have this flower structure model here. And so just for orientation purposes, north is kind of to the left, and you're looking in kind of a northeast direction on that. And you can map this flower structure from the HINC1 line to the HINC2 line, which was very encouraging to see. So as you map that across, it ended up that the trend of that structure is about north 35 degrees west, and it's about 50 to 75 meters wide, which is pretty significant. And on the left side there, you can see one of the bore logs that we got from one of the drills that had been there before. And the reflections and the profiles line up really nicely with the layers that the drillers had found as well, which is also very encouraging. That blue layer is a reflection within the clay. I'm not sure if that's because the drillers didn't log everything absolutely specifically or what that is, but in my opinion, it is just a reflection within that clay layer itself. And then the red layer is that fine sand, which is likely could be a source of that liquefaction feature of those sand blows when that shaking occurred. So that flower structure ended up being really pretty, being able to put them together like that. And then some other things to note are these two, this other fault that you can see. That is the secondary one on the sides. So didn't do as much looking into that one because the flower structure took a majority of the time. But that is another thing that you can see there. And so it'd be really nice if somebody else could go back over me, just like I went back over Aurora and map that maybe a little bit more and see what else can be done. And in the future, it would also be good if you could go a little bit up the Daytona Beach lineament and maybe do some trenches and see if you can actually see these structures in the ground. And everything like that. So yeah, that was all.
Does anyone have a question for Lindsey?
Yeah, I have a question about analysis. So you apply a bandpass filter about 35 to 150 or something. Is there a reason? Is that like a sweet spot, or is there a reason that?
Excuse me. That depended on that data itself. It doesn't actually, it's not necessary to be that interval every single time. It was this data seemed to have needed it at that point, especially on HINC2 required a little bit more analysis because of that drainage ditch that was along it. So that was another step to do in that data processing.
And what determines that you go by certain rates? What are the criteria?
So when you look at the data and you have it kind of like all in the computer in each one of like the shot gathers, there's this wave, that's the surface wave that you cut out. It makes it look a whole lot cleaner. The first HINC1 line didn't have that due to the asphalt on the road had such a high velocity that it didn't catch that. So it kind of depends on data to data of what you'd have to look for that.
Does anyone else have a question?
I love the fact that the signals produced by hitting stake with a hammer?
Yeah, 5 times at each spot. So, I mean, Doc got really strong that trip.
So how sensitive to the signal generation are variations in the force that the hammer delivers to the item?
We did have a couple times where either the trigger that's attached to the hammer wouldn't go off, or it would go off at like a wrong time. If you double bounce, for example, so like if you hit it and you accidentally get like a double tap of it, it'll hit twice and it's not supposed to do that. So in some cases very sensitive, in some cases not sensitive enough. So we'd have to redo a couple of them, but that's easy to catch when you're in the field. But they had to hit it pretty hard, and just to cause enough energy to propagate through to be able to get a good reading.
Any other questions? Let's give Lindsey another round of applause. Control the mouse again. There we go. Okay. So our next presentation will be from Connor Henderson with an honors in biochemistry for his research assessing the interaction between YFDW and YFDU from Escherichia coli. Please applaud as he comes to the stage. Thank you.
All right, so like she said, I'm Connor, and this is assessing the interaction between YFDW and YFDU from E. coli. So first I want to talk about kidney stone disease. It is currently the most common urinary tract disease in the world, and it costs hospitals a great deal of time, money, and other resources that could otherwise be allocated elsewhere given better treatment methods. And as this figure suggests, the incidence is steadily growing, and with this steady growth, so too will the need for better treatment methods grow. And here is the chemical structure of calcium oxalate, which forms calcium oxalate stones, which are the most common form of kidney stone, making up about 80% of all incidences. So that makes them the primary target when developing treatment methods. One promising probiotic that metabolizes oxalate to drive ATP synthesis is Oxalobacter formigenes, and this is the mechanism it uses. And FRC and OXC are very important enzymes in this mechanism, as FRC activates oxalate to form oxalyl-CoA, and this oxalyl-CoA is then decarboxylated by OXC to form formal-CoA, which is then used in the next round. And the oxal-T antiporter protein imports oxalate concomitantly with formate, or with the export of formate, which results in a net +1 charge outside the cell, which forms this proton gradient that then drives ATP synthesis. And this is a very inefficient way of synthesizing ATP, so any other hindrances to this process would be fairly detrimental. And since formal-CoA is susceptible to hydrolysis, there must be some way that OXC and FRC protect this label substrate. And the way that this is thought to happen is through a mechanism similar to substrate channeling, in which the substrate is never released into solution. A similar system known as the oxalate-dependent acid-tolerant system is found in E. coli. And the main difference here is that it uses it to allow it to survive low pH environments, whereas Oxalobacter uses it to drive ATP synthesis. And in this mechanism for E. coli, it uses homologous enzymes to those found in Oxalobacter. And here is a structural comparison of YFDW and FRC to confirm that they are indeed homologous to each other. So YFDW is homologous to FRC, and YFDU is homologous to OXC. And since they are homologous, they should have similar interactions. Thus, since E. coli is a much more accessible biological system, we can use these enzymes from E. coli, YFDW and YFDU, to then investigate those interactions of their homologs in oxalate vector. So based on this, we hypothesize that YFDW and YFDU will have tight interaction and form a strong complex that might facilitate substrate channeling to protect this labeled substrate of formal-CoA. To test this hypothesis, we plan to conduct pull-down assays of overexpressed YFDW and YFDU using the other as an affinity labeled construct. And to do this, we needed to first obtain purified samples of both proteins, which we would first do by cleaving the protein, or lysing the proteins to obtain the crude protein extract, which is shown here. And you can see there's the his-tagged YFDW or YFDU, doesn't really matter which one. And then the non-specific proteins, which are all the soluble proteins from inside the cell. And we also have the nickel column. So we would then pour this through the nickel column and wash with low imidazole concentration, which would push off the non-specific proteins, while the his-tag proteins would remain immobilized in the resin. We would then use high imidazole concentration to then elute our his-tag proteins to obtain the purified protein sample. We could then use these purified protein samples in the pull-down assays, and we would mix the cleaved protein of YFDU in this case, and mix with the his-tagged other protein, YFDW, and allow them to, well, they should form a protein complex. And this would then be poured through the nickel column and bind and be immobilized in the resin, and if our hypothesis is correct, the protein complex should remain intact and they should flow through or elute at the same time. So to get overexpressed protein to purify, we needed to make an expression vector or a construct, which we needed to first amplify the genes encoding for these proteins from E. coli's genomic DNA. And here's just a table of the primers that we use for that. And then here is our expression vector that we plan to insert the gene into. And some of the important sites, like the NCO1 site, which is where we would digest the plasmid to linearize it, and it would be where we insert the gene. There is the LAC operator, which we would use to induce overexpression with IPTG. The 6-his tag, which is used in affinity labeling. The TEV site, which is where we cleave the proteins using TEV protease. The T7 promoter, which we will use as a primer in Sanger sequencing. The thioredoxin domain, which contributes to the protein solubility and also helps to differentiate between cleaved and non-cleaved proteins. And finally, the kanamycin resistance gene, which allows us to select for cells containing our construct. So here's just a closer look at the cloning site frame so you can see kind of how cleaving works and what happens. So you can see the TEV site comes just before the NCO1 site, and attached to that is the thioredoxin domain and the 6-his tag. So once you use TEV protease, it cuts at that TEV site just before the gene, removing the 6-his tag so it can then flow through. or will have an uncleaved protein. So here is a gel of when we attempted to run PCR to amplify our genes from E. coli's genome. And as these strong signals are correlating with the proper sizes, we had a good amplification and could use these in cloning. However, the restriction digest here was not complete, so we had an incomplete linearization as there's very little or very weak bands at the proper size of around like 8,000 base pairs. So then we needed a more complete linearization to continue. And here's just a gel showing a more complete linearization, like I said. So we then attempted infusion cloning with stellar competent cells, and if it was successful, we would expect growth on the YFDW and YFDU plates. And since we have growth here, we can say that this reaction was successful and we had successful transformation. We then verified these constructs by double digest using NCO1 and BAMH1. And since we had a cleavage pattern consistent with our expected sizes, we could then move on and transform using our expression strain, BL21 star DE3 competent cells, which are basically specialized to allow you to express proteins or overexpress proteins, and the growth on the plates indicates that that was successful. So we then attempted protein overexpression using IPTG induction of the lac operon, and this growth curve indicates the cell density levels versus time, and we just needed to confirm that we had viable cell density levels to express. So then we ran SDS page to visualize our results, and we could not detect any overexpression in this SDS page, as there are no distinct bands at the correlating sizes of 54 KDA for YFDW and 68 KDA for YFDU. So to determine what went wrong with protein overexpression, we decided to conduct Sanger sequencing of our constructs, and these are the primers that we use for that. And for the results of the YFDU sequence alignment, they showed partial coverage, and from this we couldn't really confirm if the sequence was in frame because it didn't show much of the construct, and there are also no determinant mutations in this one as it was so inconsistent. As for the YFDU construct sequence alignment, it had even less coverage, and from that we also couldn't confirm if the sequence was in frame. However, in the areas that I guess, that it was consistent, there was a possible valine 193 alanine mutation. However, this mutation wouldn't be expected to have much of an impact on the structure and function of the protein, as they are both nonpolar and aliphatic. So from this, we can say, from these results, we can say that overexpression was obviously unsuccessful, and we can't really be confident in our constructs. So future directions would be to optimize our methods to successfully overexpress proteins and continue with the experiment where we left off. And to do that, we could run Sanger sequencing again using different primers that would hopefully get better coverage of our construct. And also, another thing that we could test are the kinetic parameters of the enzymes together to compare them to when they're working individually to see if they are more effective in the presence of each other. So for my acknowledgements, I'd like to thank my honors committee, Dr. Toyota, Dr. Kramer, and Dr. Rice, of course. And I'd also like to thank Nezem and Sam for their help in the lab. And finally, I'd like to thank the Millsaps Honors Program for providing all the funds needed to carry this out. And that's all I have
Do you have any questions for Connor?
Yeah, I have a question about the design. So the idea is to express one of the properties of the stack to aid purification. So do you think that that would interfere with the complex forming with the presence of the stack?
Well, the goal is to express both of them, and then ultimately you just would have the protein, and then you use TEV protease to cleave off the his tag.
Or you cut the his tag off?
Yes, using TEV protease.
And that's before you put the two proteins together?
Yeah, you do that with one of them, so then the other one will keep the his tag, and that one will bind, and then if they have strong interactions, the protein complex.
One of them keeps its tag. Might it interfere in, what you would expect of,
I don't think so, not really. But maybe. I could always be wrong.
Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, let's give another round of applause for Connor. So that concludes our presentations for today. We'll start back tomorrow at 8:45 a.m. with a breakfast. Session 3 will follow with another round of presentations at 9:30 a.m. So I want to say thank you for everyone for attending today and showing your support for the honors program. And of course, congratulations to everyone who presented today. So let's give our presenters one more round of applause.